of Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson. It is on a gorgeous 5,000-acre plantation. I don't recall that it was a plantation. I don't recall it ever being called that. Virginia has a tradition of separating itself a little, like it's not quite the North, it's not quite the South, it's definitely not the Deep South. I understand that. I'm from Texas. We have that kind of that same cultural thing going on. It was the home of Thomas Jefferson, not once referred to as a plantation, and nor did I think of it that way at the time, even though I knew large crops were grown there, and approximately 400 enslaved people lived there over the years. They were mentioned that day. They lived and worked on the grounds. There were cabins for the enslaved people, but Jefferson was clearly the star. The enslaved people were almost like an afterthought. We wouldn't want to ruin the tour. The grandeur of Monticello, which is built in a neoclassical design on top of an 850-foot summit, is indeed a beautiful, beautiful architecture. Jefferson's role as a statesman, a planter, a diplomat, a lawyer, and an architect and philosopher were discussed at much greater length than his role as an owner of enslaved humans. It was not long after visiting Monticello that I became a Unitarian Universalist and started learning about its history. I felt pride that men like Jefferson and John Adams were Unitarians and involved in our early church. The church that I attended belonged to the Jefferson District of Unitarian Universalist Association, and I was surprised to hear that there was talk of changing its name due to Jefferson owning enslaved people. And it eventually was, but not until 2011. That would have been more than 10 years later after I first heard of it. And it was changed for that reason, and he had troubling views about Native Americans and women as well. I did not really know or think about this at the time, that was an important act of bearing witness. I remember at the time, I found it even a little extreme. So not to get lost, but now we're going to take an even bigger leap. We're going to move 25 years and all the way to the other side of California. We're in Chico, California now. And not that long ago, our UUFC book group read The Way the Word is Passed, a reckoning of the history of slavery across America by Clint Smith. Has anyone here read or listened to this powerful book? It's a powerful book. It was chosen as the Chico State Book in Common, and several of our members also went to see Clint speak at Chico State in April. Unfortunately, I wasn't there. I had not listened to it yet, but there was so much buzz and people talking about that book around here and how powerful it was and how it had changed their thinking on things that I decided that I would listen to it. And it's wonderful to listen to because it's read by the author, and he's very charismatic. I would encourage everyone to read it. Clint Smith, in the book, he talks about going all over the U.S. and one place in Africa, speaking to all kinds of people and exploring the history of slavery in our country. It is beautifully written, and it is easy to follow, but that does not mean it's easy to read. He is a master storyteller. He vividly shares the painful stories of many enslaved men, women, and children in this country. He does not share these stories to blame or cause guilt, but to bring understanding. And I can attest to that. I did not, unlike some things that have been exposed to in the past, I never felt any guilt. It wasn't his meaning, and he's just a beautiful, heartfelt writer who intends to bear witness, to transform and heal. Understanding our history as a nation, both the good and the bad, brings healing and understanding to our current situation. Sometimes unknowingly, but often knowingly, we've been taught sanitized, romanticized history of our country. Clint Smith does not suggest we vilify people like Jefferson, but try to understand the complexity of our history. It is hard to understand how a man like Jefferson could be brilliant in some ways and fall so short in others. He argued passionately for religious freedom and the rights of man, yet he enslaved hundreds of human beings. To come to terms with U.S. history and how our nation got here today, we need to come to terms with this very paradox. We need to acknowledge that most of our wealth, power, and freedom in our country today were acquired through the use of enslaved people. We can acknowledge the good, and we should, but we cannot heal unless we bear witness to the wrongs, the pain, and the suffering. In his book, Clint Smith tells of visiting Whitney Plantation near New Orleans. It was a very different experience than I had at Monticello back 25 years ago. And I'm sure Monticello has changed over the years, but it still has a different mission. The Whitney Plantation shares the life of the residents. And the star isn't one person, as the majority of the residents on that plantation over the years were enslaved people. And I wonder what it would have been like that day if at Monticello I had been given a better glimpse of what it was like for most of the people to live there and what their lives were like. So this brings me back to my question about that day so long ago when I chased that crying woman to the bathroom. Why haven't I spoken out more in my life? Why have I not acted out more in my life? Why don't I practice the spiritual discipline of bearing witness more often when it does feel good? I think to bear witness, we have to be open and see the connection between things. And that's why I call it a spiritual practice. We must open ourselves to the interdependent web of all existence and see the connections. It's beautiful to see the web, but why don't we do that more? I think sometimes it's just too overwhelming, because when we open ourselves to the universe, we see great joy and we see great beauty, but there is also ugliness, pain, and sorrow. I think when we talk about the interconnected web a lot, we think of the beauty, the awe of nature, the joy and compassion of humanity. But we are also connected to the ugliness. We are connected to the good things that happened in the history in our country, and we are connected to the bad. And so it's scary. It's scary, and it's almost impossible to live like that. Or I would say it's impossible. We can't go around in awe and spiritual connected, and we drive our roads off the car. We wouldn't be able to function. So we have to block ourselves out and limit it. But we also need to remember to let that in. It can also be painful and scary. Like, wow, I grew up knowing these things. I understood things. And when I accept new ideas and let them in, it's scary. We realize like the structures of our life are a lot more wobbly and less secure than we once thought. But once we open ourselves to that joy, that wonder, that ugliness, the interconnected web of all existence, then we can bear witness. We can bear witness to the crimes against nature and our planet. It's then that we can bear witness of individuals' hurts and sorrows as well as groups. This doesn't mean we accept blame, and it also means we need to try not to blame, because we are connected to both the oppressed and the oppressor. We don't get to just connect with the people whose side we want to take. We understanding like this, like how our country has been affected by slavery, you have to understand both sides, or we wouldn't be here without all of it, the good and the bad. Ways to bear witness can be art, and here's some grand pieces. The Names and Project AIDS quilt had over 4,800 panels. The National Memorial for Peace and Justice commemorates black lynchings by hanging 850 pieces of steel, one for each county in the U.S. where lynchings happened. We've seen numerous writings, books like Clint Smith's book, films, but it can also happen in a smaller way, just us telling each other stories. I've heard so many stories from people in this congregation over the years, things they witnessed through the years in their lives, or things that happened to themselves or their neighbors. We can bring these stories forward, and we can make a difference by merely opening ourselves up and speaking out and bearing witness. Amen.